It did not begin with a victory speech or flashing cameras. It began with silence, the kind that empties highways in minutes and replaces traffic with burning engines and distant gunfire. And if you think this is just another episode in Mexico's long drug war, stay with me. What happened was not routine. It was a shockwave. In the early hours of February 22nd, 2026, Mexican forces launched a precision strike in the mountains of Jalisco. The target was not a regional boss or a logistics chief. It was the head of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, a man who had built a criminal empire stretching across continents and had survived for years by staying one step ahead of intelligence agencies. That night, his luck ran out. The operation was the result of weeks, possibly months, of signals intelligence, surveillance, and coordinated tracking. Mexican Army units, National Guard forces, Air Force support, and federal intelligence moved in with precision. U.S. agencies provided complementary intelligence as part of escalating cross-border cooperation. The timing was impossible to ignore. Washington had been demanding visible results in the fentanyl fight, with economic pressure and political threats mounting. Delivering the most powerful cartel leader in the country was more than tactical success. It was geopolitical leverage. When special forces closed in on the compound in Talpa, they met heavy resistance. CJNG gunmen opened fire. The quiet mountain town turned into a battlefield. The cartel leader and his bodyguards attempted to escape through wooded terrain. Helicopters lifted overhead. Pursuit units pushed through rugged hills. By the end of the engagement, several cartel members were dead. The leader was critically wounded, airlifted, and reportedly died before reaching Mexico City. What was left behind inside the compound was not the arsenal of a street gang, but of a paramilitary force, armored vehicles, heavy-caliber weapons, tactical equipment built for sustained combat. Within hours of confirmation, more than 250 coordinated roadblocks erupted across at least 20 states. Vehicles were hijacked and set on fire along federal highways. Major corridors into Guadalajara, host city of the 2026 World Cup, were sealed in smoke. Businesses burned, public transit stopped, entire districts went dark. What looked like a single operation had triggered a nationwide reaction. This was not chaos. It was a message. At least 25 members of the Mexican National Guard were killed in 6 separate coordinated attacks in Jalisco alone. Cartel commanders reportedly offered bounties of over $1,000 per soldier killed. Think about what that implies. That is not spontaneous rage. That is structured retaliation with incentives designed to maximize casualties among security forces. In addition to those deaths, dozens of cartel members were killed in running gun battles across Jalisco and neighboring Michoacan. A prison guard and a state prosecutor's agent were also killed in separate incidents. The total confirmed death toll surpassed 70 within the first phase of the operation and its aftermath, though authorities declined to provide a full breakdown. The absence of detailed accounting raises uncomfortable questions about civilian casualties caught in crossfire. The geographic spread of the violence reveals something even more unsettling. Jalisco saw at least 65 roadblocks. Puerto Vallarta, a major tourist destination, reported multiple vehicles and commercial buildings set on fire. Residents described gunshots echoing through streets lined with resorts. In Michoacan, unrest affected at least 13 municipalities. Disturbances were reported in Veracruz, Colima, Aguascalientes, Guerrero, Guanajuato, Nayarit, and Tamaulipas. Coordinated down to the minute, these disruptions required pre-positioned cells, ready vehicles, fuel supplies, communication networks, and command structures capable of mobilizing instantly. This was a contingency plan waiting for a trigger. In Puerto Vallarta, chaos deepened. Social media footage showed plumes of smoke near commercial centers. Witnesses described execution-style killings near airport routes. Reports of attempted prison breaks surfaced as cartel members sought to free detained operatives. The international airport operator confirmed that most flights were canceled. Major airlines suspended service. Thousands of tourists found themselves stranded. The U.S. State Department issued shelter-in-place advisories for American citizens in multiple states, urging them to remain inside residences or hotels. Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, China, and India released similar travel warnings. Imagine arriving for a vacation and suddenly being told not to leave your hotel room because a cartel has effectively sealed the city. Meanwhile, President Claudia Sheinbaum acknowledged the roadblocks, but emphasized that in the vast majority of the country, normal activities continued. Additional security forces were deployed to Jalisco. By late evening, authorities claimed that roughly 90% of roadblocks had been cleared, but clearing debris from highways does not erase what the response demonstrated. It took over 12 hours to regain partial control. For half a day, an organized criminal network paralyzed major portions of a sovereign nation. Security analysts are now debating what comes next. Some argue that the death of a kingpin is symbolically powerful, but operationally destabilizing. Without a central authority, cartel factions can fragment, compete, and escalate violence to assert dominance. Others suggest that a successor may already be positioned, possibly a family-linked figure groomed internally. If consolidation occurs quickly, the cartel could emerge even more ruthless, determined to prove that leadership decapitation changes nothing. Former U.S. drug enforcement officials have warned that eliminating a leader without dismantling logistics, financial networks, money laundering operations, and armed wings risks triggering exactly this type of violent fragmentation. Infrastructure, not personalities, sustains cartels. The next few weeks may determine whether Mexico can exploit the temporary disarray or whether retaliatory campaigns intensify. And then there is the global dimension. Guadalajara is scheduled to host World Cup matches in a matter of months. Tens of thousands of international visitors are expected. FIFA faces unavoidable questions about readiness and security. If one organization can coordinate 250 roadblocks across 20 states within hours, what prevents future disruptions timed to major global events? Residents describe living under a system where bus schedules act as early warning signals. When public transport stops, violence is imminent. Transportation leaders have allegedly been co-opted. Entire cities can be sealed within minutes. That level of infiltration blurs the line between criminal organization and parallel governance. One thing is certain. The Mexican army killed the leader of the Jalisco New Generation cartel in Talpa. Within hours, his organization demonstrated that it retained the capacity to shut down half the country. More than 70 people are dead. At least 25 security personnel were targeted in coordinated attacks. International airlines canceled operations. Foreign governments issued shelter directives. Intelligence cooperation between Mexico and the United States was confirmed. Political pressure from Washington framed the context, and now an entire nation watches to see whether this was a decisive blow or the opening act of a far more violent phase. If you are following this story closely, this is the moment to subscribe and like this video, because the developments over the coming days may redefine not only cartel strategy, but bilateral relations and internal Mexican security doctrine. What happened was not an isolated raid. It was a signal event. The question is whether it signals stabilization or escalation. And as smoke clears from highways and armored vehicles are towed from mountain compounds, the deeper reality is still unfolding beneath the surface. What makes this moment even more dangerous is what is happening beneath the surface, beyond the burned vehicles and the dramatic footage. When a cartel of this scale loses its central figure, the vacuum is not empty for long. It becomes a battlefield. Inside the Jalisco New Generation cartel, there are operational commanders, financial coordinators, regional plaza bosses, armed wing leaders, logistics architects who control precursor chemical routes from Asia, money laundering pipelines through shell companies, and enforcement cells embedded in dozens of municipalities. The removal of a single leader does not erase that machinery. It destabilizes it. And when destabilized criminal machinery begins competing for control, violence multiplies, not decreases. The question now echoing across security circles is simple but chilling. Who moves first? And how brutal will that move be? There are indications that succession plans were not theoretical. Organizations of this size do not operate on improvisation alone. Intelligence assessments have long suggested that potential successors were groomed, including individuals with blood or marital ties to the fallen leader. If a family-linked successor steps forward quickly, the cartel may attempt to project continuity and strength through displays of force. But if rival commanders challenge that transition, internal purges could erupt. And when purges happen inside organizations that control ports, highways, and entire corridors of fentanyl production, civilians often become collateral damage in power demonstrations. That possibility alone is enough to make Mexican authorities uneasy, because fragmentation has historically triggered spikes in kidnappings, extortion rackets, forced recruitment, and localized massacres as factions scramble to secure revenue streams. Look at the economic implications. Jalisco is not an isolated rural state, it is a commercial engine. Guadalajara is a technology hub sometimes called Mexico's Silicon Valley. It is also a logistics crossroads connecting Pacific ports to interior industrial corridors. When 250 coordinated roadblocks can paralyze transport arteries, supply chains freeze, perishable goods spoil, manufacturing halts, export schedules collapse, investors watch closely. If international perception shifts from isolated criminal violence to systemic instability, capital flows respond accordingly. That is why the speed of restoration matters as much as the tactical success of the raid itself. Confidence is fragile, and organized crime understands the leverage of spectacle. Now consider the fentanyl pipeline. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel has been widely described as a key player in synthetic drug production, sourcing chemical precursors through global supply chains and converting them into product destined for the United States and beyond. If leadership disruption fractures coordination, rival groups may fight over access to laboratories, trafficking routes, and border crossings. Alternatively, a rapid consolidation under new leadership could intensify production to demonstrate resilience. Either path carries consequences for U.S. domestic policy, because Washington's pressure campaign is unlikely to ease after such a dramatic event. If violence escalates further, discussions of expanded cross-border cooperation, surveillance integration, or even more controversial measures could return to the forefront of political debate. There is also the human dimension inside Mexico. Communities caught between security forces and cartel gunmen experience more than headlines. Businesses pay protection money or close. Families monitor social media rumors to decide whether it is safe to send children to school. Taxi drivers weigh the risk of operating when roadblocks can appear within minutes. When residents say they watch bus terminals as an early warning system, that reflects a society conditioned to interpret routine disruptions as signs of impending violence. The psychological impact compounds over time. Fear becomes ambient. And ambient fear erodes trust in institutions if protection appears inconsistent. What about the military response going forward? Clearing roadblocks is reactive. Sustained pressure requires dismantling command and control structures, intercepting financial transactions, seizing assets, disrupting arms procurement, and targeting communications nodes. That demands intelligence fusion across agencies and borders. It demands patience. And it demands political will, because sustained operations carry political costs. If the campaign intensifies and violence temporarily increases, public patience may strain. Yet if operations pause, cartels regroup. This is the strategic dilemma Mexico now faces. International observers are also calculating the impact on the 2026 World Cup. Stadiums can be fortified, perimeters can be secured. But the broader question is whether underlying criminal ecosystems can exploit the attention surrounding global events. The recent demonstration of rapid mobilization capability will not be forgotten by security planners. Every major match, every influx of international visitors, every broadcast watched by millions will now be evaluated through the lens of this eruption. The cartel may not need to strike directly at an event to exert influence. The mere perception of vulnerability can shape diplomatic and commercial decisions. And then there is the possibility that this wave of violence was not simply retaliation, but signaling. By erecting hundreds of roadblocks within hours, the organization effectively communicated that removing one man does not dismantle the network. It was a message directed at the Mexican government, at Washington, at rival cartels, and at local communities. It said, "We remain operational, coordinated, and capable of paralyzing territory at will." Whether that message translates into sustained confrontation or gradually subsides into strategic recalibration remains to be seen. But signals matter in criminal ecosystems. Reputation is currency. Some analysts warn that if smaller cells perceive weakness at the top, alliances could shift rapidly. Groups that once cooperated may defect. Rival cartels might test newly contested territories. Border regions could experience flare-ups as opportunistic actors probe for advantage. Each localized clash carries the risk of civilian casualties and retaliatory spirals. In past fragmentation cycles, violence has not stayed neatly confined. It radiates outward. At the same time, Mexican authorities are under immense pressure to demonstrate that the state retains the monopoly on force. Deployments of additional troops, visible patrols, and public assurances are part of that demonstration. But credibility depends on sustained stability, not momentary restoration of traffic flow. The next several weeks will be critical. Will attacks on security personnel continue? Will bounty-style incentives reappear? Will extortion calls increase in commercial districts? These indicators will reveal whether the cartel is reorganizing quietly or preparing further escalation. There is also the broader geopolitical layer. Intelligence cooperation between Mexico and the United States has deepened in recent years, but it is politically sensitive. Any perception of overreach can ignite domestic backlash. Yet the fentanyl crisis and cross-border trafficking ensure that Washington remains deeply invested in outcomes. The death of such a high-profile figure may be portrayed as a victory, but if subsequent violence intensifies, critics will question strategy on both sides of the border. Was the kingpin approach sufficient? Should infrastructure targeting have preceded decapitation? Could contingency planning have mitigated retaliation? These debates are already forming in policy circles. What makes this story so volatile is that it sits at the intersection of domestic security, international diplomacy, economic stability, and organized crime evolution. It is not a single incident. It is a pivot point. And pivot points are unpredictable. They can mark the beginning of decline for powerful networks, or they can trigger adaptation that makes those networks more elusive and decentralized. If you have followed this entire breakdown, now is the time to subscribe and like this video, because we are tracking developments as they unfold and separating spectacle from structural change. The death of one of Mexico's most powerful cartel leaders has already rewritten the immediate security landscape. Whether it rewrites the long-term balance of power depends on what happens next, and that next chapter is still being written in real time.